Mark and I had been close since college. We built our cybersecurity firm, Sentinel Systems, from nothing. He was calm, decisive, the kind of man people followed without question. When he married Sabrina, I thought he had it all: beauty, intelligence, stability. I liked her at first, until small details started to bother me. She was too observant, too careful about what she said and when she said it. Over time, I began to notice patterns. Business dinners that didn't align with schedules. Late-night calls that ended the moment Mark entered the room. Her growing influence over company matters, especially finances and client relations, despite not being on payroll. The confirmation came unexpectedly. I saw her at a downtown hotel with one of our clients, a man from a competing firm. Their body language told the whole story. I didn't confront her, not yet. I just knew I couldn't hide it from Mark. It wasn't about morality, it was about loyalty. Before I had a chance to tell him, she acted first. She approached me, calm and deliberate. She already knew I had seen her. She claimed that I had been pursuing her, that she had told Mark everything. There was no panic in her, only control. The realization hit fast: she had set the stage long before the act began. Within a week, my life collapsed. HR summoned me over concerns of inappropriate behavior. Access to company servers was revoked. My email vanished from directories. The official line was an internal review, but everyone knew what that meant. Sabrina had poisoned every corner of my reputation. Mark cut contact completely. No calls, no messages, no explanations. The silence was louder than any accusation. Clients withdrew, whispering about professionalism and image. My role in the company I co-founded evaporated as if I had never existed. I packed my office into one box and walked out without saying a word. I left the city the same night. My name had become a stain no one wanted to be near. Betrayal wasn't new to me, business was full of it, but this was personal. I wasn't just replaced, I was erased. On the drive out, I tried to make sense of it all. Sabrina had turned exposure into strategy. She hadn't just cheated, she'd planned the narrative in advance, making me the fall guy before I even spoke. In a coastal town a few states away, I found a small apartment above a bookstore and started over. For months, I replayed every detail, every word, every meeting. Her manipulation was surgical, she had known exactly how to weaponize trust. I realized she wasn't simply unfaithful. She was strategic, using relationships like currency. At first, I told myself to forget. But forgetting was impossible when I thought of Mark. He didn't just lose a friend, he was losing everything to the person destroying him from within. I couldn't watch it happen. I decided that if I couldn't defend my name, I'd at least defend his future. That's when I contacted Gideon Frost, a private investigator with a reputation for finding what others couldn't. I sent him what little background I had: timelines, client names, financial movements. If there was a way to prove Sabrina's schemes, he'd find it. The first months were quiet. Then pieces started coming in: small inconsistencies, secret transactions, unexplained wire transfers. They all led back to her. The more I learned, the clearer it became that my downfall had been only a fraction of her plan. She was feeding company data to competitors and siphoning money through shell accounts under her maiden name. The pattern was meticulous. She had turned Mark's success into her private cash stream, and the moment the company went under, she'd disappear with everything. Each new document from Gideon deepened my resolve. What she had done to me was personal, but what she was doing to Mark was unforgivable. He had believed her so completely that she didn't even bother hiding her tracks anymore. I wasn't sure if it was arrogance or overconfidence, but it would be her undoing. By the time I realized how close the company was to collapse, I knew I couldn't stay in the shadows much longer. Every day that passed, Mark slipped further into debt and discredit, thinking he was simply unlucky. He didn't know the storm was built inside his own house. I decided to reach out, one last time. Not for forgiveness, just for a chance to show him the truth. Whatever he chose to do after that would be his decision. I didn't expect him to believe me, but I couldn't stand by and let him lose everything to her lies. That night, I drafted a single message, brief and stripped of emotion. It wasn't an apology or explanation. It was a request to meet. I pressed send and waited in the dark, knowing Sabrina would see it too. I didn't know it then, but that message would set off the chain of events that changed everything, for all of us. The first months away from the city were a blur of quiet obsession. My life reduced itself to numbers, files, and patterns. Every night I scoured old backups, contracts, and archived emails, searching for the one thing that would make sense of the chaos. But every lead circled back to the same name, Sabrina. She had buried her tracks well, but not perfectly. Through an encrypted forum for corporate fraud investigators, I found Gideon Frost, a former detective who specialized in tracing money that wasn't meant to be found. His methods were gray, his results clean. I sent him what I knew: dates, client lists, company structures, and a copy of Sentinel Systems shareholder logs from before I was erased. It was enough to start digging. Weeks later, the first piece surfaced: a consulting firm registered in Delaware, created 2 months before I was accused. Its listed owner was a phantom, but its invoices came directly from our clients, payments meant for Sentinel that had been quietly rerouted. The account holder name wasn't Sabrina's, but her maiden initials appeared in the registration. I felt the old anger sharpen into something colder. This wasn't just betrayal, it was theft planned down to the smallest detail. She hadn't destroyed me for revenge or fear, she'd done it to cover her operation. I wasn't a threat to her marriage. I was a threat to her business. The deeper Gideon went, the uglier it became. The rival company that kept underbidding us was receiving internal data, pricing sheets, project specs, private proposals. It wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. Sabrina was leaking classified information and getting paid for it through a chain of shell companies. Every transaction passed through an account disguised as consulting revenue, then vanished offshore. Mark had no idea. He was still the loyal partner, convinced his wife was keeping the company afloat while I was the one who betrayed him. From what Gideon gathered, Sentinel was collapsing from within. Projects were failing, employees leaving, investors whispering about mismanagement. Every dollar lost was feeding her network. By late spring, the company's finances were hanging by a thread. Credit lines were shrinking. Lawsuits loomed. Gideon called it the pre-collapse phase, the part where predators feed faster before abandoning the carcass. Sabrina was already preparing her exit. She had purchased real estate through a third-party broker, using a trust registered in another state. The timing told the story: she was cashing out before everything burned. I couldn't watch Mark go down blind. The evidence was mounting: screenshots, transaction records, location data from her phone, all pointing to coordinated theft and espionage. Each night, I printed files, pinned them across the walls of my small apartment until it looked like a crime board. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was proof. But proof without power is nothing. I needed Mark to see it himself, to hear it from me, not through rumors or files. I knew the risk: if Sabrina caught wind of any contact, she'd move faster. Still, I couldn't wait for the company to die. I reached out to Gideon one last time, asking how much longer until everything connected. He told me we had enough. The accounts, the communication logs, the pattern, it was airtight. If I wanted to save Mark, this was the moment. That night I sat in the dark, watching rain hit the window. I realized how much she had taken from both of us. Not just careers or money, but trust, the one thing neither of us could rebuild. The thought of Mark working beside her, believing in her, while she drained him dry, made my stomach turn. I decided to act. I called Mark. My voice was steady but cold. I told him we needed to meet, that I had something that could change everything. I didn't beg or explain, I gave him a time and a place. Bennett's Bar, our old spot. 7 o'clock. It was familiar enough to disarm suspicion, public enough to feel safe. The day of the meeting, I got there early. The bartender still recognized me, though I doubt he remembered from where. I took the far booth with a view of the door. The clock ticked slowly, each minute stretching like a warning. I kept checking the entrance, expecting Mark to appear, expecting the moment to finally turn the tide. He didn't come. At first, I thought maybe he'd changed his mind. Then unease started to rise. Mark was never late, not for meetings, not for anything that mattered. I tried calling once, twice. No response. My instincts, trained by years of reading between lines, told me this wasn't hesitation. It was interruption. When my phone rang again, it was Gideon. His tone was tight, urgent, almost breathless. There had been an accident outside the city: Mark's car, overturned on Highway 32. My body went cold before he even finished the sentence. I was already running before I realized it. The bar lights blurred behind me, streets streaking past in gray smears of rain and motion. The drive felt endless. Every second burned with the thought that Sabrina had overheard everything. She must have. She'd always been one step ahead, and she'd just made her most desperate move yet. When I reached the crash site, police lights painted the road in blue and red flashes. Mark's car lay twisted in the ditch, glass scattered across wet asphalt. The air smelled of smoke and oil. Paramedics were shouting over sirens. I pushed through the barrier before anyone could stop me. He was still alive, barely. They were pulling him out, pale and bloodied, but breathing. At the hospital, the doctors moved fast. He was in critical condition but stable. His brakes had failed completely. It wasn't coincidence. It was precision. I stayed in the hallway until morning, numb, watching nurses move in and out of his room. Around sunrise, I stepped outside, breathing cold air that tasted like metal. The truth hit me harder than any accusation ever could. Sabrina had tried to erase the only witness left who could expose her. That's when it stopped being about justice. It became war. The night after the accident stayed frozen in my mind like a photograph burned into film. I could still see the wreck, the twisted metal, the smell of gasoline hanging in the air. The doctors said Mark would live, though it was a narrow escape. His ribs were fractured, his shoulder broken, and his lungs bruised from the impact. The report mentioned mechanical failure. The police called it unfortunate. I called it something else. While Mark lay unconscious, I waited outside his hospital room, reading through the accident report line by line. The brake line had been severed cleanly, no corrosion, no gradual wear. It was deliberate. I didn't need proof to know who had arranged it. Sabrina had always moved ahead of exposure, eliminating threats before they spoke. She had done it to me, and she had just done it to her own husband. I spent the following days sleeping little, drinking coffee that went cold before I finished it. Gideon sent updates from his end, records of calls, messages, transfers. It was all there, a digital footprint of a woman dismantling her husband's empire piece by piece. Each log revealed a transaction routed through offshore banks, each timestamp aligning perfectly with company losses. It was so obvious now that I wondered how no one else had seen it. But then again, deception works best when wrapped in trust. The hospital became my base. I read financial data in the cafeteria, mapped timelines in the parking lot, and memorized the faces of every visitor who came near Mark's room. Sabrina visited once, only once. She wore black, the color people choose when they want to look solemn but clean. She didn't stay long. When she left, she didn't glance toward me, but she knew I was there. Her composure was perfect, her control absolute. She walked out as though nothing had happened. When Mark finally woke, I wasn't sure what to expect. I watched through the glass as the nurse adjusted his fore. His face was pale but focused, his eyes sharp despite the haze of recovery. He didn't ask for her. He didn't ask for anyone. Maybe he already knew something was wrong, or maybe instinct whispered what logic hadn't yet confirmed. I didn't rush to show him the evidence. I waited until he could sit up without pain, until he could absorb what I had to give him. When I did, I laid everything in front of him, bank statements, leaked proposals, hidden accounts, photographs of the competitors' offices she had visited, even the message chain that tied her directly to the rival CEO. I didn't need to speak, the facts did it for me. He went through the file slowly, his face tightening with each page. Betrayal has a way of aging a person in minutes. By the time he reached the end, he looked like a man who had lost not just a wife, but a version of reality he'd trusted for years. I recognized that expression because I had worn it once myself. Over the next week, we met quietly in the hospital's garden during late hours when the place emptied out. We planned in silence, exchanging notes instead of words. There was no time for emotion. We knew Sabrina was watching. She still controlled the company's communications and could track every move Mark made. The only advantage we had was that she believed he was still in recovery, unaware of her betrayal. We needed to move before she realized her mistake. Mark had been the public face of Sentinel Systems, his word still carried weight among investors and partners. If we could gather the right evidence and release it strategically, we could expose her and salvage what was left of the company before she vanished with the funds. I handled the digital forensics, while Gideon managed the legal framing through his contacts. Mark reached out to a few trusted board members from a private device Gideon provided, ones who had grown suspicious of the company's recent losses. Each step was methodical, precise. We couldn't afford another miscalculation. As the plan took shape, I began to feel something strange, hope. Not just for revenge, but redemption. For a year I had been the villain in someone else's story. Now, I had the chance to write the ending. By the time Mark was discharged, everything was in place. The audit meeting was scheduled. Every major investor, executive, and board member was invited. The pretext was simple, a quarterly review of finances. Sabrina wouldn't suspect anything until it was too late. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. My mind replayed the past year in fragments, the parking lot confrontation, the accusation, the exile, the wreck. All of it had led to this moment. If it worked, the truth would finally see daylight. If it didn't, we'd both lose what was left of our names. In the morning, Mark dressed in a suit for the first time since the accident. His arm was still in a sling, his posture stiff, but his expression steady. There was no trace of hesitation. He was done being blind. We arrived early at the Sentinel headquarters, the same building from which I had been escorted out a year earlier. Walking through the lobby again felt surreal, like stepping into a memory that had never fully faded. Employees glanced at me with unease, unsure if they were seeing a ghost. In a way, they were. Inside the conference room, the screens were already lit, waiting. Mark's laptop contained every piece of evidence we had collected, organized, timestamped, verified. The first slide bore the company's logo, the last slide bore her name. When Sabrina walked in, she smiled the way she always did, measured, calculated, utterly confident. She took her seat beside him, unaware that the ground beneath her was about to collapse. As the lights dimmed and the presentation began, I sat quietly in the corner, watching the truth unfold on screen, one image at a time. The room filled slowly, executives drifting in with laptops and notebooks, unaware that they were about to witness the end of a lie that had defined an entire company. The projection screen glowed against the polished table. Mark stood at the head, posture straight despite the healing injuries, a sling still strapped across his shoulder. He looked calm, not broken, not vindictive, just precise. The meeting began like any other quarterly review. Slides displayed the company's financial health, projected earnings, and risk assessments. Sabrina watched, professional and composed, occasionally adjusting a strand of hair or glancing at her notes. She had spent months pretending to hold the company together, the loyal wife holding the empire while her husband recovered. The investors trusted her image, they always had. She radiated control, that was her disguise. Then, slowly, the data shifted. Charts of revenue streams appeared on the screen, annotated with discrepancies. Transactions duplicated in foreign accounts. Vendor names that didn't exist. Each slide moved closer to her handwriting, her approval stamps, her authorization codes, her digital signatures. The room began to quiet. Screens reflected in the eyes of men and women who understood numbers more than faces. They saw what Mark and I had seen for months, a bleeding system. Mark never raised his voice. He simply changed slides, letting the information strip away her mask. With each page, Sabrina's composure thinned. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her pen. She glanced toward the exit once, a subtle motion that betrayed her calm. The final segment contained what she couldn't deny: bank statements, timestamped transfers, offshore routing logs. Then came the recordings. Her voice filled the speakers, soft, confident, unmistakable. She was speaking to the CEO of a rival firm, discussing project timelines, sharing bid information, confirming deposits. Her tone was businesslike, detached, as though betraying her husband's company was just another deal to close. The room remained silent, frozen in collective disbelief. She looked smaller with every passing second, trapped between denial and recognition. When the recording ended, Mark turned off the projector. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It was the silence of realization, the moment everyone in the room understood who she really was. Security entered quietly. There were no outbursts, no grand speeches. The board chair simply nodded. Sabrina rose from her seat slowly, still trying to maintain dignity, but her face had lost all color. As she walked out, I caught her glance. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. Even cornered, she was measuring possibilities, searching for another escape route that didn't exist anymore. By the time the meeting ended, the company had already begun drafting statements for the press. Legal teams were activated, audits launched, partnerships frozen for review. Gideon's files had been submitted to the authorities earlier that morning, insurance in case anything went wrong. But nothing did. The plan had been too thorough, the evidence too airtight. The next day, news broke. Sentinel Systems was cleared of internal suspicion and began proceedings against the rival firm for corporate espionage. Sabrina's accounts were frozen, her assets seized. Her name dominated headlines: the betrayal, the scandal, the crash. She had built her influence through illusion, and now the illusion was publicly dismantled. For weeks after, I stayed out of sight, content to let the story unfold on its own. My role was invisible by design. I didn't need recognition, I needed closure. The same reporters who once hinted at my disgrace now wrote about her downfall, though none of them connected the two events. It was better that way. Mark called once he was ready to face the world again. When we met, he looked older but lighter, the kind of exhaustion that follows survival. There was gratitude in his expression, though no words were necessary. We both knew what it had cost: years of trust, reputation, almost his life. He had built a company out of partnership and nearly lost it to the person he loved most. We spent that evening in quiet conversation about rebuilding, restructuring, and letting go of what couldn't be repaired. The friendship wasn't the same, but it was still there, burned, scarred, but alive. That was enough. In the months that followed, Sentinel Systems began to recover. Investors returned, clients renewed contracts, and the company's name slowly detached from the scandal. Mark reinstated me as an external consultant. It wasn't about titles anymore, it was about finishing what we had started years ago, before deceit had poisoned everything. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Sabrina, not with anger, but curiosity. People like her don't destroy others for pleasure, They do it because they can. Manipulation is their native language. She had almost succeeded completely. Almost. There are moments when I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed silent, if I had ignored the hotel lobby that day. Perhaps she would have won entirely, and Sentinel would be nothing but a cautionary tale about misplaced trust. But fate has a strange sense of balance. Lies rot from the inside, and hers simply decayed faster than she could cover them. I never saw her again after that meeting. Her trial dragged through the courts for months, her defense unraveling under the same precision she once used to deceive. She became a headline, then a footnote, then forgotten. Mark rebuilt quietly, focused on work, not vengeance. I did the same. The city eventually stopped whispering about us. Every time I pass the old Sentinel building, I remember that day, the dark room, the projection light, the quiet collapse of her empire. It wasn't triumph I felt, only relief. The kind that comes when truth finally drags itself out of the shadows, even if it has to crawl through blood and ruin to get there. What remained between Mark and me wasn't the same friendship we'd started with, but something stronger. It wasn't built on shared success anymore, it was built on survival. And that, after everything, felt like the most honest thing in the world.